The rain hammered against the grimy window of Keith Urban's studio apartment on the outskirts of Nashville, each droplet seeming to echo the rhythm of his failures. It was late October 2001, and the cramped room on Dickerson Pike felt more like a prison cell than the launching pad for dreams he'd once imagined it would be. Keith sat on the edge of his second-hand mattress, his favorite Martin guitar resting across his lap, staring at the eviction notice on the small wooden table beside him. 3 days. He had 3 days to come up with 2 months' rent, or find himself on the street. The apartment smelled of stale coffee and defeat. Paint peeled from the corners of the ceiling, revealing water stains that had been there long before Keith moved in 4 years ago. His belongings were sparse: the guitar, a duffel bag of clothes, a hot plate that barely worked, and a collection of rejection letters from record labels that he'd kept as some kind of masochistic reminder of every door that had slammed in his face. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to dance mockingly across the walls. Keith's fingers moved absently across the guitar strings, playing a melody that had been haunting him for weeks. It was beautiful and melancholic, capturing everything he felt but couldn't say out loud. At 34 years old, he'd spent the better part of a decade chasing a dream that seemed determined to stay just out of reach. He'd left everything behind in Australia: his family, his modest success as a session musician, the comfortable predictability of home, for Nashville, for the promise of making it in country music's most competitive arena. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the sound of rain and guitar. Keith didn't move at first, knowing exactly who it was. His manager, Dennis Callahan, had been calling 3 times a day for the past week, each conversation more uncomfortable than the last. Finally, on the 5th ring, Keith reached over and picked up the receiver. "Keith, we need to talk," Dennis said without preamble. His voice carried the weight of bad news delivered too many times. "Capitol Records made their decision. They're not renewing your contract." Keith closed his eyes, though the words weren't surprising. His debut album had been released 18 months ago to lukewarm reviews and disappointing sales. The label had given him chance after chance, but radio stations weren't playing his singles, venues were cancelling his shows, and the country music establishment seemed determined to keep him at arm's length. He was too rock, they said. Too Australian. Too different from what country audiences wanted. "They said they believe in your talent," Dennis continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from notes, "but the market isn't responding. They need to focus their resources on artists with more commercial momentum." "Commercial momentum," Keith repeated flatly. "That's a nice way of saying I'm a failure." "That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. You're incredibly talented, Keith. But talent alone isn't enough in this business. Timing matters, luck matters, and right now, I'm broke. I'm about to be evicted, and I just lost my record deal." Keith interrupted, his voice rising. "I get it, Dennis. Message received loud and clear." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Keith could hear Dennis breathing, could picture him sitting in his cluttered office downtown, surrounded by glossy photos of clients who'd actually made it. "What are you going to do?" Dennis finally asked. Keith looked at the plane ticket sitting on top of his rejection letter collection. He'd bought it 3 days ago, in a moment of clarity that had felt more like surrender. Sydney via Los Angeles. One way. Departure date: November the 2nd. "I'm going home," he said quietly. "Keith, don't make any rash decisions. Let's talk about this. Maybe we can—" "There's nothing left to talk about, Dennis. I gave it everything I had. It wasn't enough. End of story." Keith hung up before his manager could protest further. The apartment felt even smaller after the call ended. Keith set down his guitar and walked to the window, watching rain sheet down in the glow of the streetlights below. Nashville had seemed so full of promise when he'd first arrived. He remembered driving down Broadway for the first time, seeing the neon lights of Tootsie's Orchid Lounge and the Ryman Auditorium, feeling electricity in his veins. This was where legends were made. This was where Hank Williams had performed, where Patsy Cline had recorded, where every great country artist had passed through on their way to immortality. But Nashville had a way of chewing up dreamers and spitting them out broken. For every success story, there were thousands of failures, talented musicians who'd given everything they had, only to limp back home defeated. Keith had always believed he'd be different. He'd practiced until his fingers bled, written hundreds of songs, played every dive bar and honky-tonk that would have him. He'd survived on ramen noodles and hope, convinced that persistence would eventually pay off. He'd been wrong. The rain intensified, and Keith thought about his family back in Australia. His mother had cried when he left, though she'd tried to hide it. She'd always supported his music, even when his father had expressed doubts about pursuing such an unstable career. His brothers had thrown him a farewell party, making jokes about him becoming the next Keith Richards, while secretly worrying he was making a mistake. What would he tell them when he came home? How would he explain that he'd failed? Keith's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He opened the small refrigerator, finding it nearly empty, except for a half-empty jar of peanut butter and some wilted lettuce. His bank account had exactly $47 in it. He'd sold most of his equipment over the past few months just to make rent, his pedals, his backup guitars, even his amp. All he had left was the Martin guitar his grandfather had given him before he died, and he'd rather starve than sell that. There was a time when Keith's calendar had been full. Small gigs, sure, but gigs nonetheless. Bars along Broadway, songwriter nights at the Bluebird Cafe, opening slots for bigger acts passing through town. But after the album flopped, those opportunities dried up. Venue owners stopped returning his calls. Other musicians avoided eye contact when they saw him around town, as if failure were contagious. The whole city had a way of knowing when you were down, and Nashville showed no mercy to the fallen. 3 nights ago had been his last performance, and it had been a disaster. The Continental, a small bar on Gallatin Pike, had booked him for a Tuesday night slot. Keith had shown up early, sound-checked, and prepared to give it everything he had. But when showtime came, there were only 6 people in the audience, and 3 of them were employees. He'd played his heart out anyway, pouring every ounce of emotion into songs that deserved better than empty rooms and disinterested bartenders. Halfway through his set, a drunk patron had yelled, "Play some real country music." Keith had tried to laugh it off, but the comment had stung. What was real country music anyway? Was it only steel guitars and songs about pickup trucks? Couldn't it evolve? Couldn't it include someone with an Australian accent who played guitar like he was channeling both country and rock simultaneously? After the show, the bar owner Raymond Tucker had pulled Keith aside. Raymond was a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd been in the Nashville music scene for decades. He spoke with the weary authority of someone who'd seen it all. "Keith, you're a hell of a guitarist," he'd said, counting out $40 from the register. "But I can't book you again. I need acts that bring in crowds. It's nothing personal, it's just business." Keith had taken the money without argument and walked out into the cold October night, knowing it was over. He'd given Nashville everything, and Nashville had rejected him. There was nothing left to do but accept defeat and go home. Now, standing in his apartment with an eviction notice and a one-way ticket home, Keith felt hollow. He picked up his guitar again and played the melancholic melody that had been haunting him. The notes seemed to capture everything he couldn't articulate: the heartbreak, the disappointment, the shame of failure, the death of a dream. His fingers moved across the frets with practiced precision, creating something beautiful even in the midst of his despair. Music had always been his refuge. When words failed, when life became too heavy, he could pour everything into his guitar and find some measure of peace. But even that comfort felt tainted now. What was the point of creating beautiful music if no one wanted to hear it? What was the point of having talent if the industry didn't value it? The phone rang again. Keith ignored it this time, letting it ring until the caller gave up. He knew it was probably Dennis trying to talk him out of leaving, or maybe his landlord calling about the rent. It didn't matter. His mind was made up. In 6 days, he'd be on a plane back to Australia, and this entire chapter of his life would be over. He thought about calling his mother, letting her know he was coming home, but he couldn't bring himself to do it yet. The conversation would involve explanations he wasn't ready to give and sympathy he wasn't ready to receive. His mother would be kind about it, which somehow made it worse. She'd tell him that trying was what mattered, that there was no shame in giving your dream your best shot. But Keith didn't want platitudes. He wanted the pain to stop. The rain continued its relentless assault on the window. Keith set down his guitar and lay back on the mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Tomorrow he'd start packing his meager belongings. He'd call his landlord and explain that he was leaving, see if he could work out some arrangement about the back rent. He'd sell whatever else he could, maybe get enough for a decent meal before the flight. Then it would be done. Nashville had broken him. The city that made stars had crushed his dreams beneath its boot heel and moved on without a second thought. As Keith closed his eyes, listening to the rain and the distant sound of traffic on the pike, he tried to remember why he'd ever believed he could make it here in the first place. The next morning brought grey skies and a chill that seeped into Keith's bones. He woke early, his body still operating on the schedule of a working musician, despite having nowhere to be. The apartment looked even more depressing in the pale morning light. Keith made instant coffee with water heated on the hot plate and sat at the small table, forcing himself to make a plan. First priority, talk to the landlord. Vincent Moretti owned the building and a dozen others like it, scattered across Nashville's less glamorous neighborhoods. He was a gruff man who'd immigrated from Italy 40 years ago and built a modest real estate empire through hard work and tighter fists. Keith had been late on rent before, but never this late. He needed to explain the situation and hope Vincent would let him leave without legal complications. Second priority, sell whatever remained of value. Keith looked around the sparse apartment. There wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books, kitchen items that belonged to the apartment. The only thing of real value was his guitar, and that wasn't an option. He'd sleep on the street before selling his grandfather's Martin. Third priority, say goodbye. Keith had made few close friends during his time in Nashville. The music industry wasn't conducive to genuine relationships. Everyone was competing for the same scarce opportunities, and today's friend could be tomorrow's rival for a record deal or a spot on a tour. But there were a few people who'd shown him kindness, and he owed them a proper farewell. Keith finished his coffee and grabbed his jacket. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the grey sky like mirrors. He walked the 3 blocks to Vincent's office, a cramped space above a laundromat that smelled perpetually of detergent and cigarette smoke. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed to the second floor. Vincent sat behind a metal desk piled high with papers, receipts, and accounting ledgers. He was in his 70s now, with a shock of white hair and hands weathered by decades of manual labor before he'd transitioned to property management. He looked up when Keith entered, his expression neither friendly nor hostile. "Mr. Urban," Vincent said, his Italian accent still thick despite his decades in America. "I assume you're here about the rent." "Yes, sir," Keith replied, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I wanted to talk to you about my situation." Vincent gestured to a folding chair across from his desk. Keith sat, feeling like a student called to the principal's office. "I'm listening," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm leaving Nashville," Keith said directly, "going back to Australia. My flight is on November 2nd. I know I owe you money and I want to work something out." I'll send you payments as soon as I get back home and find work." Vincent studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You're a musician, yes? I see you always carrying that guitar case." "Yes, sir, or I was trying to be. Didn't work out." "Many musicians come to Nashville," Vincent said, lighting a cigarette despite the no smoking sign on his wall. "Most leave. Few make it. Is a very difficult business." "Yes, sir, it is." Vincent took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "I came to America with nothing. 23 years old, didn't speak English, had $50 in my pocket. I worked construction, saved every penny, bought my first building in 1968. Everyone told me I was stupid, that I'd fail. But I didn't fail, because I didn't give up." Keith nodded, unsure where this was going. "You're giving up," Vincent said bluntly. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't recognize the look? I've seen it hundreds of times. Someone hits hard times, decides it's easier to quit than to keep fighting. With respect, Mr. Moretti, you don't know my situation," Keith said, feeling defensive. "I've been fighting for years. Sometimes you have to know when you're beat." "Maybe," Vincent conceded, "or maybe you're quitting right before the breakthrough. It's impossible to know." He stubbed out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. "Here's what I'm going to do. You can stay in the apartment until your flight. No rent. But if you change your mind about leaving, you owe me everything. The back rent, November's rent, all of it. Deal?" Keith blinked, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Mr. Moretti, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering. Take it or don't, makes no difference to me." Vincent turned back to his paperwork, signaling the conversation was over. "Thank you," Keith said quietly, standing. "I appreciate it more than you know." Vincent waved a dismissive hand without looking up. Keith left the office feeling slightly less burdened, but still hollow inside. Vincent's kindness didn't change the fundamental reality. Keith had failed, and going home was the only sensible option remaining. The rest of the day passed in a grey blur. Keith packed his belongings, which fit easily into 2 duffel bags. He sorted through his collection of rejection letters, reading each one as a form of self-punishment. Not the right fit for our label. Doesn't align with current market trends. Lacks commercial appeal. The phrases all meant the same thing. You're not good enough. By late afternoon, Keith found himself drawn to downtown Nashville despite himself. He walked down Broadway, past the neon-lit honky-tonks that were just beginning to fill with tourists and locals alike. Live music poured from every doorway, fiddles, steel guitars, voices raised in classic country anthems. This street never stopped, never slowed down. Music was the heartbeat of Nashville, and Broadway was where that heartbeat was loudest. Keith stopped outside the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music. He'd toured it once, walked across the stage where legends had performed, felt the weight of history in every wooden pew and weathered floorboard. Standing there now, he felt the full weight of his failure. He'd never perform on that stage. He'd never join the pantheon of artists who'd made Nashville their home and country music their legacy. "You okay, buddy?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Keith turned to see an older man in a security uniform standing nearby, concern on his face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Keith lied. "Just taking it all in one last time." "Leaving town?" "Leaving the country, actually. Heading back to Australia." The security guard nodded knowingly. "Nashville's not for everyone. Takes a special kind of stubborn to make it here. But hey, at least you tried." "That's more than most people can say." Keith managed a weak smile and continued walking. He found himself heading toward the Bluebird Cafe, a small venue in a strip mall that had launched countless careers through its songwriter nights. Keith had performed there twice, both times to audiences more interested in their conversations than his music. But the Bluebird represented something important in Nashville's ecosystem, a place where raw talent could potentially be discovered, where the right person in the right seat might hear something special and change your life forever. The evening show was already underway when Keith arrived. He paid the cover charge with precious dollars he couldn't afford to spend and found a seat in the back corner. 4 songwriters sat in the center of the room in the traditional in-the-round format, taking turns playing their compositions. The audience listened attentively, respectfully silent during performances, and warmly appreciative between songs. Keith recognized one of the performers, Jackson Brennan, a talented songwriter who'd had songs recorded by several major country artists. They'd crossed paths at various venues around Nashville, shared stages a few times. Jackson was everything Keith wasn't: smooth, confident, commercially viable. His songs had hooks that grabbed you immediately, and lyrics that told stories audiences wanted to hear. As Keith sat there listening, he felt the familiar mix of admiration and envy that had plagued him throughout his Nashville years. These people were making it, finding success, building careers. What did they have that he lacked? Was it just luck, or was there some fundamental quality he was missing? During the break between rounds, Jackson spotted Keith and came over. "Keith Urban. Man, I haven't seen you in months. How have you been?" "Been better," Keith admitted. "Been worse too, I suppose." Jackson sat down in the adjacent chair, his expression becoming more serious. "I heard about Capitol dropping your deal. That's rough, man. I'm sorry. Word travels fast in this town." "Nashville's a small city disguised as a big one," Jackson said. "What are you going to do now?" "Going back to Australia. Flight's in a few days." Jackson's eyebrows rose. "Seriously? You're giving up?" There was that phrase again. Giving up. Everyone seemed to think Keith was taking the coward's way out. "I'm being realistic," Keith said more sharply than intended. "I gave it everything I had. Sometimes everything isn't enough." "Listen, I get it," Jackson said, his tone sympathetic. "This business is brutal. It'll break your heart in 100 different ways. But you're talented, Keith. Really talented. Your guitar playing is better than half the session musicians working on Music Row. Your voice is unique. Your songs have depth. But not commercial appeal, apparently." "Commercial appeal is bullshit," Jackson said bluntly. "It's just industry speak for sounds like everything else. The artists who really matter, who really last, they're the ones who bring something different, but different takes time to catch on." Keith shook his head. "I don't have more time, Jackson. I'm broke. I'm being evicted. My record deal is dead. What am I supposed to do? Sleep in my car and hope something magically changes? I don't know, man. I just hate seeing you leave right when—" Jackson stopped himself. "Right when what?" "Nothing. Never mind." Jackson stood up. "I've got to get back up there. Good luck in Australia, Keith. I mean that sincerely." They shook hands, and Jackson returned to the center of the room for the next round. Keith stayed for one more song, then slipped out into the cool October night. The conversation had left him unsettled. Everyone kept hinting that he was making a mistake, that he should stay, that something might change. But hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. Keith walked back to his apartment, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, watching his breath form clouds in the cooling air. The streets were quieter here, away from Broadway's tourist bustle. Working-class neighborhoods where people struggled to get by, where dreams were sacrificed for survival. Keith felt at home among these streets in a way he'd never felt among the industry people downtown. When he reached his building, he found someone sitting on the front steps. As he got closer, he recognized Christina Hayes, a waitress from the Continental, who'd always been kind to him during his performances there. She was in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing her work uniform under a light jacket. "Christina, what are you doing here?" She stood up, looking slightly embarrassed. "Raymond told me you were leaving Nashville. I wanted to say goodbye properly, not just in some awkward moment at work." Keith was touched, despite himself. "That's really kind of you." "You were always professional, always polite," Christina said. "Do you know how rare that is? Most musicians treat servers like we're invisible. You always remembered my name, always tipped well even when I knew you couldn't afford it. You worked hard. You deserved respect. See, that's what I'm talking about." Christina pulled an envelope from her jacket pocket. "This is for you." Keith took it hesitantly. Inside was $400 in cash. "Christina, I can't accept this," he said immediately, trying to hand it back. "Yes, you can, and you will," she said firmly. "I've been saving up to visit my sister in Colorado, but I can do that any time. You need this more than I need a vacation. This is too much. I can't—" "Keith, shut up and take the money," Christina said, but her eyes were kind. "Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better. When you're a big star, you can pay me back with interest." Keith felt emotion tightening his throat. "I'm going back to Australia. I'm not going to be a star. Maybe not. But maybe you will be. Just somewhere else. Either way, you deserve a chance to figure it out without starving." Christina stepped forward and hugged him briefly. "You're a good person, Keith Urban. Don't let this city make you forget that." She left before Keith could protest further, walking quickly down the street toward the bus stop. Keith stood there, holding the envelope, overwhelmed by unexpected kindness. $400 wouldn't change his fundamental situation, but it meant he could eat properly for his remaining days in Nashville and still have money when he landed in Australia. He climbed the stairs to his apartment and sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the cash in his hands. People kept surprising him, Vincent with his rent forgiveness, Jackson with his encouragement, Christina with her selfless generosity. Nashville was full of sharks and opportunists, but it also held genuinely good people trying to help each other survive. Keith's guitar sat in the corner, its case covered in stickers from various venues where he'd performed over the years. Each sticker represented a night of music, a moment when he'd connected with an audience, however small, a reminder that he'd given this dream everything he had. On impulse, Keith picked up the guitar and headed back out into the night. He walked to Centennial Park, a large green space that housed a full-scale replica of the Parthenon. The park was mostly empty at this hour, just a few joggers and dog walkers scattered across the grounds. Keith found a bench near the Parthenon and sat down, guitar across his lap. He started playing, not for anyone but himself. The melancholic melody that had been haunting him for weeks poured out, and this time he added words. "I gave you everything I had to give. Sold my soul just trying to live. This dream that's dying in my hands, I'm a stranger in a stranger's land." The words came easily, born from genuine pain and disappointment. Keith sang quietly, his voice carrying across the empty park. He wasn't performing for an audience or trying to impress anyone. He was just creating music because it was what he did, who he was, even if the industry didn't want him. A few people paused in their evening walks to listen from a distance, but Keith barely noticed. He was lost in the music, using it to process everything he was feeling, the grief of a dream dying, the shame of failure, the uncertainty of what came next. The song evolved as he played, becoming more complex, more honest, more real than anything he'd written in years. When he finally finished, Keith sat in silence, his hands resting on the guitar strings. The night air was cold enough that he could see his breath, but he didn't feel it. He felt numb and alive simultaneously, empty and full of music. That was beautiful. Keith jumped, startled by the voice. He turned to see an elderly woman standing a few feet away, wrapped in a heavy coat. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. I was walking my dog and heard you playing. That song, it came from somewhere deep, didn't it?" "Yeah," Keith said quietly. "Yeah, it did. I've lived in Nashville for 60 years, the woman said. "I've heard a lot of music in that time. Yours is special. Don't give up on it." She walked away before Keith could respond, her small dog trotting beside her. Keith watched her go, then looked up at the night sky. Stars were beginning to appear as the clouds cleared. tiny points of light in the vast darkness. Don't give up. Everyone kept saying that, as if persistence alone could change reality. But Keith knew better. Sometimes you had to accept defeat and move on. Sometimes quitting was the brave choice, not the cowardly one. He packed up his guitar and headed back to his apartment, trying to silence the small voice in his head that wondered if maybe, just maybe, everyone else was seeing something he'd become too defeated to see in himself. November 1st dawned clear and cold. One of those Tennessee autumn days where the sky was impossibly blue and the air carried just enough bite to remind you winter was approaching. Keith woke to sunlight streaming through his apartment window. His flight to Australia now less than 24 hours away. He'd spent the previous day finishing his packing, cleaning the apartment to leave it in decent condition for Vincent, and trying not to think too hard about what leaving meant. Today was his last full day in Nashville, and Keith had decided to spend it revisiting the places that had meant something during his years here. A farewell tour of sorts, though he wasn't sure if it would bring closure or just deepen the sadness that had settled in his chest like a stone. He started with breakfast at Pancake Pantry in Hillsborough Village, a local institution famous for its lines of tourists and locals willing to wait an hour for their sweet potato pancakes. Keith had come here after his first successful gig in Nashville, feeling on top of the world, convinced he was on the verge of something great. Today, sitting alone in a corner booth, that memory felt like it belonged to someone else. After breakfast, Keith walked through Vanderbilt University's campus, enjoying the fall foliage and the energy of college students hurrying between classes. He'd sometimes played guitar in Centennial Park near the campus, busking for spare change when money was especially tight. Those had been humbling days, his ego stripped away as pedestrians walked past without acknowledgement, occasionally tossing quarters into his open guitar case, more out of pity than appreciation. By early afternoon, Keith found himself drawn once again to Broadway. Despite everything, he loved this street. The energy was infectious, the music constant, the sense of possibility tangible, even for someone whose possibilities had run out. He walked slowly, peering into each honky-tonk, watching musicians perform for crowds that ranged from enthusiastically engaged to pleasantly drunk. At Robert's Western World, Keith stopped and watched through the window as a young band tore through a classic Johnny Cash cover. The lead singer couldn't have been more than 22, full of confidence and raw talent. Keith remembered being that young, that certain of his destiny. What would he tell his younger self if he could? Would he warn himself that Nashville would break his heart? Or would he let the dream play out anyway, because some lessons could only be learned through experience? Keith, a voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Patrick Henderson, a session musician he'd worked with on a few recording projects. Patrick was a steel guitar virtuoso, one of the most in-demand players on Music Row. "Man, I thought that was you. How have you been?" "Hey, Patrick, I've been okay, just taking one last walk through downtown before I leave." "Leave? Where are you going?" "Back to Australia. Tomorrow, actually." Patrick's friendly expression faltered. "Are you serious? Why?" Keith gave him the abbreviated version, the lost record deal, the financial struggles, the decision to go home. Patrick listened with genuine concern, shaking his head when Keith finished. "That's rough, brother. I'm sorry things didn't work out. But hey, you gave it a real shot. That takes guts." Patrick paused, then added, "Actually, you know what? I'm heading to a session on Music Row in about an hour. Studio B at RCA. Why don't you come with me? Not to work, just to hang out one last time. See a proper Nashville recording session before you go." Keith hesitated. The invitation was kind, but the thought of watching other musicians successfully making music while his own career lay in ruins felt masochistic. Still, Patrick's expression was so genuinely friendly that Keith found himself nodding. Sure, why not? They walked together up Broadway, chatting about inconsequential things, the weather, mutual acquaintances, changes in the music scene. Patrick had an easygoing nature that made conversation comfortable, never dwelling on Keith's failures or offering unwanted advice. When they reached Music Row, the heart of Nashville's recording industry, Keith felt a familiar mix of excitement and bitterness. RCA Studio B was legendary. Elvis Presley had recorded there. Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, the list of icons who'd worked in that room was staggering. Patrick led Keith through a side entrance, greeting the receptionist by name, clearly someone who belonged in these spaces. Keith followed, feeling like an outsider, which technically he was now. The studio itself was smaller than Keith had imagined, but the atmosphere was electric. Several session musicians were setting up their instruments, drums, bass, keyboards, guitars. A producer worked in the control room, adjusting levels and talking through the talkback system. Everyone moved with professional efficiency, people who'd done this hundreds of times and knew their roles perfectly. "Keith, grab a seat in the corner there," Patrick said, gesturing to a chair near the back. "We're cutting tracks for Jennifer Morgan's new album. You know her?" Keith shook his head. The name wasn't familiar, which wasn't surprising given how disconnected he'd become from the Nashville mainstream over the past year. "She's got a great voice, signed with Monument Records about 6 months ago," Patrick explained while tuning his steel guitar. "This is her debut album, Big Expectations." The session began, and Keith watched with professional appreciation as the musicians worked through their parts. They were recording a mid-tempo ballad about lost love, the kind of song that played constantly on country radio, emotionally direct, melodically strong, commercially viable. The musicians nailed their parts with minimal takes, their skill evident in every note. Keith felt simultaneously inspired and discouraged. This was the top tier of Nashville musicianship, and he understood with painful clarity that he'd never reach this level. Not because he lacked talent, his guitar playing could match anyone in this room, but because he'd never get the opportunity. The industry had passed its judgment, and that judgment was final. During a break, Patrick came over with bottles of water. "Pretty cool, right? This is what I love about Nashville. On any given day, you're in a room with some of the best musicians in the world." "It's impressive," Keith agreed sincerely. "You're really good at what you do, Patrick." "Thanks, man. It took years to get here, lots of struggling and doubt, but I kept showing up, kept getting better, and eventually the work came." Patrick took a drink of water. "You know, you should stick around. I could introduce you to some people, see if we can get you some session work. You're too talented to just disappear." Keith shook his head. "I appreciate that, but my flight's tomorrow. My mind's made up." Before Patrick could respond, there was a commotion near the studio entrance. Voices raised in greeting, laughter, the unmistakable energy of someone important arriving. Keith looked over and felt his breath catch. REBA MCENTIRE had just walked into the studio. She was dressed casually in jeans and a black blouse, her famous red hair pulled back, but her presence filled the room immediately. Everyone perked up, smiles brightening, postures straightening. REBA had that effect, a genuine superstar who somehow remained approachable and kind despite her enormous success. "Hey, everyone!" REBA's Oklahoma accent was warm and friendly. "Don't let me interrupt. I was meeting with someone upstairs and heard y'all were cutting Jennifer's album. Thought I'd stop by and say hi. Do you want to sing?" The producer came out of the control room to greet her, and soon REBA was making her way around the studio, chatting with each musician personally, asking about their families, making jokes that had everyone laughing. She was gracious and present in a way that reminded Keith why she'd remained beloved throughout her decades-long career. When REBA reached Patrick, they exchanged a warm hug. "Patrick Henderson, are you making my steel guitar parts sound boring by comparison?" "Nobody could do that, Miss McEntire," Patrick said with genuine affection. "Hey, I want you to meet someone. This is Keith Urban. He's a guitarist and singer-songwriter. Keith, this is... I know who she is, Keith said, standing quickly, feeling suddenly nervous. It's an honor to meet you, Miss McEntire. Reba's handshake was firm, her smile genuine. Please, call me Reba, Urban. That's an unusual last name. Where are you from? Australia, originally. Been in Nashville for about 4 years. 4 years? That's a good stretch. What kind of music do you play? Keith found himself stumbling over the answer, unsure how to describe his style to someone who embodied country music royalty. Country mostly, but with rock influences. I play guitar, write my own songs. That sounds interesting, Reba said, and Keith could tell she actually meant it. Are you working on anything currently? Patrick jumped in before Keith could answer. Keith's actually leaving Nashville, flying back to Australia tomorrow. Reba's expression shifted, becoming more focused. Tomorrow? That's sudden. Why are you leaving? Keith felt everyone's attention on him and wanted to disappear into the floor. Just time to go home, he said vaguely. Things didn't work out the way I'd hoped. Something in Reba's expression suggested she understood far more than Keith had said. She'd been in the music industry long enough to recognize defeat when she saw it. Well, before you go, I'd love to hear you play something. Do you have your guitar with you? It's back at my apartment. Patrick, you have a spare acoustic around here somewhere, don't you? Reba asked. In my car, actually, Patrick said. I'll grab it. No, that's really not necessary, Keith protested, feeling panic rising. I don't want to take up everyone's time. You're not taking up anything, Reba said firmly but kindly. Humor me. I want to hear what Australian country rock sounds like. Patrick was already heading to get the guitar, and Keith realized there was no graceful way to decline. The other musicians had returned to their break, chatting among themselves, but clearly interested in what was about to happen. Keith felt exposed, vulnerable, like a fraud about to be revealed. Patrick returned with an acoustic guitar, nothing fancy but well-maintained. Keith took it, his hands trembling slightly as he sat back down and began tuning. His mind raced, trying to decide what to play. Should he choose one of his more commercial songs, trying to impress, or something more personal and honest? In the end, he chose honesty. Keith began playing the melancholic melody he'd been working on, the one that had poured out of him in Centennial Park. His fingers moved across the unfamiliar fretboard, finding their way through muscle memory and emotion. When he started singing, his voice was quiet at first, then grew stronger. I gave you everything I had to give, sold my soul just trying to live. This dream that's dying in my hands, I'm a stranger in a stranger's land. Every door I knocked on closed, every hope I had was lost, paid in full what dreaming cost. Now I'm counting all the years I lost. But late at night when I'm alone, guitar in hand and miles from home, I still believe in every song, even when believing feels wrong. The studio had gone completely quiet. Keith lost himself in the performance, forgetting his audience, channeling all his disappointment and heartbreak into the music. The song was raw and imperfect, born from real pain rather than commercial calculation. When the final note faded, Keith looked up to find everyone staring at him. Reba spoke first, her voice soft but intense. Keith, that was remarkable. That came from somewhere real. Thank you, Keith managed, feeling emotionally exposed. Who told you that you should leave Nashville? Reba asked directly. Nobody told me. I'm out of options. My record deal fell through. I'm broke. I'm getting evicted. There's nothing left here for me. Reba pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Keith, her expression serious. Can I tell you something? I came to Nashville in 1975. I was 20 years old, fresh from Oklahoma, convinced I was going to be a star. You know how long it took before anything real happened? 5 years. 5 years of struggle, rejection, doors slamming in my face. There were so many times I wanted to quit and go back home. But you didn't quit, Keith said. You're Reba McEntire. I'm Reba McEntire because I didn't quit, she corrected gently. But it wasn't because I was braver or more talented than people who did quit. I just got lucky at the right moment. And that luck only mattered because I was still here when it happened. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Keith's. What I heard just now, that talent, that authenticity, that unique voice, that's what country music needs, not another clone doing the same thing everyone else is doing. With respect, that's easy to say when you're successful, Keith said, surprising himself with his boldness. I've been here 4 years. I've tried everything. The industry doesn't want what I'm offering. The industry doesn't know what it wants until someone shows them, Reba countered. Do you think I fit the mold when I started? I was too assertive, too independent, too willing to challenge the way things were done. But I kept pushing, and eventually the mold changed to accommodate what I was doing. Keith shook his head. I don't have 5 years. I don't have 5 weeks. My flight is tomorrow, and I can't afford to change it even if I wanted to. Reba sat back, studying him carefully. The room remained silent. Everyone sensing this was a pivotal moment, but no one wanting to interrupt. Finally, Reba spoke 3 words that would change everything. Don't give up. The simplicity of the statement hit Keith harder than any elaborate speech could have. Don't give up. 3 words that somehow cut through all his rationalizations and defenses. I know you're scared, Reba continued. I know you're broke and tired and ready to surrender, but I'm telling you, as someone who's been where you are, you're closer than you think. That song you just played, that's hit material. That's something people need to hear. Even if that's true, what am I supposed to do? I have $47 in my bank account and nowhere to live after tomorrow. Reba pulled out her phone. Give me a few minutes. She walked into the control room, making a call that Keith couldn't hear. Patrick came over and sat next to Keith. Man, you didn't tell me you could play like that, Patrick said quietly. That was something special. Doesn't matter if it's special, Keith said wearily. Special doesn't pay rent. Maybe it will now, Patrick said, glancing toward where Reba was still on her phone. 10 minutes later, Reba emerged from the control room with a purposeful expression. She walked directly to Keith and handed him a business card. Jeremy Wallace, he's the manager, one of the best in Nashville. I just talked to him about you. He's willing to meet with you tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at his office. Address is on the card. Keith took the card, stunned. I don't understand. You just heard me play 1 song. 1 song was enough, Reba said. I've been doing this long enough to recognize the real thing when I hear it. Now, I can't promise Jeremy will sign you. That's between you two. But I can get you in the door, and what you do with that opportunity is up to you. My flight. Change it, Reba said firmly. Or don't. It's your choice, Keith. You can get on that plane tomorrow and go back to Australia, and nobody would blame you. You gave it an honest shot, or you can stay, take this meeting, and see where it leads. But I'm telling you, as someone who's walked this road, don't give up right before the breakthrough. Keith felt like he couldn't breathe. Everything in him wanted to dismiss this as false hope, another disappointment waiting to happen. But Reba McEntire was standing in front of him, having taken time out of her day to make a phone call on behalf of a complete stranger, asking nothing in return except that he give himself 1 more chance. I don't know what to say, Keith finally managed. Say you'll take the meeting, Reba replied with a smile. Say you'll give Nashville 1 more shot. That's all I'm asking. Keith looked down at the business card in his hands, then back up at Reba's encouraging expression. Around the studio, the other musicians were watching with barely contained excitement, as if they were witnessing something important happen in real time. Okay, Keith heard himself say. Okay, I'll take the meeting. Reba's smile broadened. Good. Now get out of here and go prepare. Show Jeremy what you showed us today, and let the rest take care of itself. Keith stood on shaky legs, still holding Patrick's guitar. Thank you, he said to Reba. I don't know why you did this for me, but thank you. I did it because someone did it for me once, Reba said simply. That's how this works. We help each other when we can. Keith left the studio in a daze, Patrick's guitar still in his hands. His friend had insisted he keep it for the night. As he walked back through Music Row, his mind was spinning. Was he crazy to consider staying? Was this false hope that would just make the inevitable failure more painful? But then he remembered Reba's words, "Don't give up." 3 words from someone who'd been exactly where he was, who'd faced rejection and doubt and kept going anyway. 3 words that suggested maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Keith pulled out his phone and called the airline, his heart pounding as he requested to change his flight. The representative quoted him a change fee that would eat up most of Christina's generous gift, but Keith agreed without hesitation. He'd figure out the money somehow. Right now, he needed to bet on himself one more time. As he walked back to his apartment in the fading afternoon light, Keith felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. Keith barely slept that night. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, alternating between excitement and terror. What had he just done? He'd changed his flight, postponed his return to Australia, gambled his last resources on one meeting with a manager who probably took the appointment only as a favour to Reba McEntire. By morning, Keith had convinced himself a dozen times that he'd made a terrible mistake. At 7 a.m., he gave up on sleep and took a cold shower. The hot water in his building was unreliable at best. He dressed in his only decent outfit, a pair of dark jeans and a button-down shirt he'd bought for his album release party 18 months ago. The shirt was wrinkled, but it was the best he had. Keith spent 20 minutes trying to tame his hair, eventually giving up and accepting that he'd always looked slightly disheveled. He ate the last of his peanut butter straight from the jar while reviewing everything he wanted to say in the meeting. He needed to seem confident but not arrogant, talented but not difficult, hungry for opportunity without seeming desperate, even though desperate was exactly what he was. The mental gymnastics were exhausting before he'd even left his apartment. At 8:15, Keith grabbed Patrick's borrowed guitar and headed downtown. Jeremy Wallace's office was on Music Row, in one of the nicer buildings that housed management companies, publishing houses, and other music industry businesses. Keith arrived 20 minutes early and sat in his car, a beat-up Honda Civic that barely ran, trying to calm his racing heart. At exactly 9 a.m., Keith walked into the building and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The office suite for Wallace Management was sleek and professional, with gold records lining the walls and framed photos of Jeremy with various country music stars. The receptionist, a young woman named Andrea, according to her nameplate, greeted him warmly. "Keith Urban, Mr. Wallace is expecting you. Can I get you some coffee or water?" "Water would be great, thanks." Keith's mouth was desert dry. He was ushered into a conference room with a large table and leather chairs. The wall opposite the door was entirely glass, offering a view of Music Row below. Keith sat with his guitar case beside him, trying not to fidget. Andrea brought him water in a glass bottle which felt impossibly fancy. Jeremy Wallace entered 5 minutes later, and Keith stood immediately. Jeremy was in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in slacks and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had salt-and-pepper hair and sharp eyes that suggested he'd seen every trick and heard every pitch the music industry had to offer. "Keith, good to meet you." Jeremy's handshake was firm and quick. He sat across the table and opened a leather portfolio. "So, Reba McEntire called me yesterday and said I needed to hear you play immediately. Do you know how rare it is for Reba to make that kind of call?" "I'm starting to understand that, yes. In 20 years of managing artists, she's recommended exactly 3 people to me. The first was Carrie Lansing, who's now got 4 #1 hits. The second was Brett Coleman, who's touring internationally. So when Reba calls, I listen." Jeremy leaned back in his chair. "Tell me your story, Keith. Start from the beginning." Keith took a deep breath and began talking. He explained his background in Australia, his decision to come to Nashville, his years of struggle trying to break through. He was honest about the failed record deal with Capitol, the financial difficulties, his decision to leave. He talked about his music, his influences, his belief that country and rock could blend into something fresh while staying true to both genres' roots. Jeremy listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in his portfolio. His expression gave nothing away, and Keith had no idea if his story was resonating or falling flat. When Keith finished, Jeremy set down his pen. "Okay, here's what I'm thinking. The failed Capitol deal concerns me, but it's not disqualifying. Labels make bad decisions all the time. What matters more is whether you've learned from that experience." He paused. "REBA said you played a song yesterday that blew everyone away. I want to hear it." Keith pulled out the borrowed guitar, his hands steadier than he expected. He played the same melancholic song from yesterday, but this time it felt different. The emotion was still raw, but there was something else underneath, a thread of hope maybe, or determination. When he finished, Jeremy was nodding slowly. "That's good," he said simply, "really good. The lyrics need some refinement and the structure could be tighter, but the core is there. What else do you have?" For the next 45 minutes, Keith played song after song. Upbeat numbers about hitting the road and leaving troubles behind. Ballads about lost love and lessons learned. Rock-influenced tracks with driving rhythms and guitar solos that made his fingers fly across the fretboard. He poured everything out, showing Jeremy the full range of what he could do. When Keith finally set down the guitar, emotionally exhausted, Jeremy was smiling for the first time since the meeting began. "Keith, you're the real deal," Jeremy said. "Your guitar playing is exceptional. Your voice is unique. That Australian accent adds character without being off-putting. Your songs need work, but the foundation is solid." He leaned forward. "Here's my honest assessment. Capitol dropped you because they didn't know how to market you. You don't fit neatly into the current country radio format, and that scared them, but that's exactly what makes you interesting." Keith felt hope rising, but tried to temper it. "That's very kind of you to say, but I'm not being kind. I'm being accurate." Jeremy pulled out a contract from his portfolio. "I want to sign you. Not a development deal, not a trial period. Full representation. I believe I can get you a new record deal within 6 months, and this time it'll be with a label that understands what they have." Keith stared at the contract, unable to process what he was hearing. "You want to sign me, just like that?" "Just like that," Jeremy confirmed. "Look, I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts. You've got something special, Keith. It's going to take work, and success isn't guaranteed. But you deserve a real shot with proper support behind you." "I don't have any money," Keith blurted out. "I'm being evicted from my apartment. I can barely afford food. I can't pay you any kind of advance or—" Jeremy held up a hand. "Stop. Here's how this works. I take 20% of your earnings, but only when you're actually earning. If you're not making money, neither am I, which means I'm incentivized to make sure you succeed. As for your immediate situation, I can advance you $5,000 against future earnings to get you stable. That should cover rent, food, basic expenses for a couple months." Keith felt dizzy. "This doesn't make sense. Yesterday I was leaving Nashville because I'd failed. Today, you're offering me a management contract and advancing me money. This feels like a dream." "It's not a dream, it's an opportunity," Jeremy said. "But I need to be clear about expectations. This won't happen overnight. We've got to develop your sound, write or find better songs, build relationships with labels and radio programmers. You'll need to perform constantly, network, be willing to take feedback and make changes. It's going to be hard work with no guarantees." "I understand," Keith said quickly. "I'm willing to work. I'll do whatever it takes." Jeremy slid the contract across the table. Read this carefully. Take it to a lawyer if you want, though I know you probably can't afford one right now. The terms are standard for the industry, nothing predatory. If you're comfortable with it, sign and date at the bottom." Keith read through the contract with shaking hands. The legal language was dense, but the basic terms were clear. Jeremy would represent Keith exclusively for 3 years, taking 20% of all earnings from music-related activities. Jeremy would work to secure a record deal, book performances, and guide Keith's career development. Either party could terminate with 90 days' notice if the relationship wasn't working. It was, as Jeremy had said, pretty standard, and it represented exactly what Keith needed. Someone with connections and experience willing to bet on his potential. Keith signed the contract. "Excellent," Jeremy said, shaking Keith's hand again. "Welcome to Wallace Management. Now let's talk about immediate next steps. First, that $5,000 advance. Andrea will cut you a check before you leave. Second, I want you working with Daniel Frost. He's a songwriter I work with regularly. You two will collaborate on refining your material, maybe co-write some new stuff. Third, I'm getting you back into performing regularly. Small venues for now, building momentum. Any questions?" "When do we start?" Keith asked. "Today," Jeremy said with a grin. "I'll set up a meeting with Daniel for tomorrow. In the meantime, go get your living situation sorted out, get some decent food in your system, and get some sleep. You look exhausted." Keith left the office in a daze, holding a check for $5,000 that felt surreal in his hands. In the span of 24 hours, his entire life had transformed. Yesterday, he'd been broken and defeated, hours away from leaving Nashville forever. Today, he had a management contract and enough money to survive while chasing his dream properly. As he stood on Music Row, the November sun warming his face, Keith thought about the chain of events that had led here. Vincent Moretti's unexpected kindness with the rent, Christina Hayes's generous gift, Patrick Henderson's invitation to the studio, and most importantly, REBA MCENTIRE's 3 simple words: "Don't give up." Keith pulled out his phone and called his mother in Australia. It was late evening there, and she answered on the second ring. "Keith, I've been waiting to hear from you. Did you land safely?" "Mom, I didn't get on the plane. Something happened." Keith found himself smiling as he explained everything: the encounter with REBA, the meeting with Jeremy, the management contract, the advance. His mother listened with growing excitement. "Oh, Keith, I'm so proud of you. I knew you shouldn't give up on your dream." "I was ready to, though," Keith admitted. "I was completely done. If REBA MCENTIRE hadn't walked into that studio yesterday, I'd be in Sydney right now. But she did walk in, and she heard something in you worth fighting for. That wasn't luck, sweetheart. That was your talent finally getting the recognition it deserves." After the call, Keith drove back to his apartment and found Vincent Moretti outside, supervising some maintenance work on the building. The old man looked up as Keith approached. "Mr. Urban, I thought you'd be on a plane by now." "I decided to stay," Keith said, "and I wanted to thank you for giving me those extra days without rent. If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have been able to stay long enough for things to change." Vincent studied him with those sharp eyes. "Things changed?" "Yeah," Keith said, unable to contain his smile. "Things changed." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Good. I had a feeling about you. Sometimes people just need a little more time." He paused. "You have the rent money now?" Keith laughed. "Yes, sir. All of it, including what I owed. I can pay you today." "Tomorrow is fine," Vincent said. "Today, you should celebrate." Keith spent the rest of the day handling practical matters. He paid his back rent and November's rent to Vincent. He went grocery shopping, filling his cart with fresh vegetables, good bread, decent coffee, simple pleasures he'd gone without for too long. He called the airline again and cancelled his Australia flight entirely, accepting the loss of those funds with surprising peace. That evening, Keith went to find Christina Hayes at the Continental. She was working her usual shift, and her face lit up when she saw him walk in. "Keith, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be—" "I didn't leave," Keith interrupted. "And it's because of you, partly. The money you gave me, it helped me change my flight and stay long enough for an opportunity to materialize." He handed her an envelope with $400 inside. "I'm paying you back with interest." Christina refused to take it at first, but Keith insisted. "You helped me when I had nothing. Now I can pay it forward. Please take it." She finally accepted, tears in her eyes. "I knew you were special, Keith Urban. I just knew it." Over the next week, Keith's life took on new structure and purpose. He met with Daniel Frost, the songwriter Jeremy had recommended. Daniel was in his 50s, a veteran of Music Row with dozens of hits to his credit. They worked together in Daniel's home studio, refining Keith's songs and writing new material. Daniel pushed Keith to be more disciplined in his craft, tightening lyrics and strengthening melodies. "You've got instinct and emotion," Daniel told him, "but you need technique too. The best songs make the listener feel something while also being structurally solid." Keith soaked up everything Daniel taught him, practicing for hours every day. Jeremy booked him performances at small venues around Nashville, songwriter nights, open mic sessions, anywhere Keith could get stage time and start building a following. The crowds were small, but they were attentive, and Keith began to notice something he'd never experienced before. People coming up after shows to tell him how much his music moved them. 3 weeks after signing with Jeremy, Keith was playing a songwriter night at Douglas Corner Cafe when he spotted a familiar face in the audience. REBA MCENTIRE was sitting in the back, listening intently. When Keith finished his set, she came up to congratulate him. "You sound even better than before," Reba said warmly. "I heard you signed with Jeremy Wallace. That's wonderful." "It's all because of you," Keith said earnestly. "If you hadn't told me not to give up, I'd have missed all of this." Reba smiled. "I just gave you permission to believe in yourself again. You did the rest. Keep working hard, Keith. You're on the right path." As November turned to December, Keith felt himself transforming. The desperation and defeat that had defined him were being replaced by determination and confidence. He still faced obstacles. Money was tight even with Jeremy's advance, and success remained uncertain. But he was finally getting the support and opportunities his talent deserved. One cold December evening, Keith stood on the stage at the Bluebird Cafe, about to perform in a songwriter round. As he looked out at the crowd, he remembered sitting in the audience just weeks earlier, convinced his Nashville dream was over. Now here he was, guitar in hand, singing his songs for people who actually wanted to hear them. Keith began playing, and his voice filled the intimate space with a new song he'd written with Daniel. "I was down to my last dollar and my last prayer. Ready to walk away, thought nobody cared. Then somebody saw something I couldn't see. 3 words changed everything for me." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Keith felt the connection he'd always chased, that magical moment when music bridges the gap between performer and listener, creating something shared and meaningful. This was why he'd come to Nashville. This was what he'd been fighting for all along, and finally, after years of struggle, it was beginning to happen. Winter settled over Nashville with unusual intensity, bringing ice storms that shut down the city for days, and cold that seemed to seep into every corner. But for Keith Urban, the season felt full of warmth and possibility. Each day brought progress, sometimes incremental, sometimes significant, but always forward motion. Jeremy Wallace was proving to be exactly the advocate Keith needed. He worked tirelessly on Keith's behalf, setting up showcase performances for label executives, connecting Keith with influential producers, and constantly pushing him to improve and evolve. The work was relentless and often frustrating, but Keith embraced it with renewed determination. "You've got to understand," Jeremy told him during one of their regular strategy meetings in early January, "labels are risk-averse right now. The industry is changing with digital music and everyone's nervous. We need to make you such an obvious bet that they'd be stupid to pass. To that end, Jeremy arranged for Keith to record a professional demo with some of Nashville's top session musicians. They cut 4 tracks in a state-of-the-art studio, capturing Keith's unique blend of country storytelling and rock energy with pristine production quality. When Jeremy shopped the demo around Music Row, the response was cautiously positive. "They're interested," Jeremy reported, "but they want to see audience reaction. We need to prove you can draw crowds and sell tickets." Keith threw himself into performing with new intensity. He played every venue that would book him, honky-tonks on Broadway, listening rooms in East Nashville, even a few college shows at Vanderbilt and Belmont University. Slowly but surely, he began building a following. People started coming specifically to see Keith Urban, the Australian guitarist with the powerful voice and emotionally honest songs. One particularly memorable night in February, Keith was playing at the Station Inn, a legendary bluegrass venue in the Gulch. The crowd was packed tight, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Keith was midway through his set when he noticed several Music Row executives in the audience, including Amanda Richardson from Capitol Records, the same label that had dropped him a year earlier. For a moment, Keith felt old bitterness rising. These were the people who'd given up on him, who decided he wasn't worth their investment. But then he channeled that emotion into his performance, playing with fierce intensity that had the crowd on their feet by the end of his set. After the show, Amanda approached him. "Keith, that was incredible. Your growth over the past year has been remarkable." "Thank you," Keith said, keeping his tone neutral. "Look, I know Capitol let you go, and I take responsibility for that decision. We made a mistake." Amanda handed him her card. "If you're open to it, I'd love to discuss the possibility of working together again. I think we could do something special this time around." Keith took the card, but made no commitments. "I'll consider it," he said simply, enjoying the role reversal. That conversation marked a turning point. Suddenly, multiple labels were expressing interest, each wanting to be the one to sign the Australian guitarist everyone was talking about. Jeremy fielded offers and negotiated terms, while Keith focused on his music and performances. In March, Keith got a call that made his heart race. The Grand Ole Opry wanted him to perform as a guest on their Saturday night show. For any country musician, playing the Opry was a sacred honor. It meant you'd been accepted into the family of country music, that you belonged. The night of the performance, Keith stood backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, the same building he'd stood outside months earlier, feeling like a failure. Now he was about to walk onto that legendary stage and perform for thousands of people in the audience and millions listening on radio. "You ready for this?" Jeremy asked, standing beside him. "I think so," Keith said, his guitar in hand. "I keep thinking about how close I came to missing all of this. If I'd gotten on that plane to Australia—" "But you didn't," Jeremy reminded him. "You stayed, you fought, and you earned this moment." When Keith walked out onto the Opry stage and the audience erupted in applause, he felt emotion threatening to overwhelm him. The stage was bathed in warm light, the historic circle of wood at center stage representing decades of country music history. Keith stepped into that circle and began to play. He performed one of his new songs, a mid-tempo number about second chances and the people who believe in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. His voice was strong and clear. His guitar playing showcased the technical skill that set him apart. The audience responded enthusiastically, and when Keith finished, he received a standing ovation. As he left the stage, Keith was intercepted by REBA MCENTIRE, who'd been hosting that night's show. "Keith, that was wonderful!" REBA hugged him warmly. "I'm so proud of you! Look how far you've come!" "I wouldn't be here without you," Keith said honestly. "Those 3 words you said to me, 'Don't give up,' they saved my career. They saved my life, really." Reba's eyes were bright with emotion. "You saved yourself, Keith. You had the talent and the heart. You just needed someone to remind you of that in your darkest moment." She squeezed his hand. "Now finish what you started. Get that record deal and show the world what I heard in that studio last November." 2 weeks after the Opry performance, Jeremy called Keith with news. "We have 3 solid offers on the table. Capitol is one of them, actually offering better terms than before. But I think you should go with Monument Records. They're smaller, but they really understand your vision, and they're willing to let you have creative control." Keith trusted Jeremy's judgment. They accepted Monument's offer, and Keith signed his second record deal on a sunny April afternoon. This time felt different from his first signing with Capitol. There was no naivety, no unrealistic expectations. Keith knew how hard the road ahead would be, but he also knew he had the right support system in place. Recording his album took 6 months. Keith worked with producer Nathan Greenfield, a veteran who'd helmed hits for multiple country artists. Nathan understood Keith's desire to blend country and rock, and he helped craft a sound that honored both genres while creating something fresh and contemporary. "You're not trying to fit into country music," Nathan told him. "You're expanding what country music can be. That's going to make some people uncomfortable, but that's okay. The best artists always push boundaries." The album's lead single, "But for the Grace," was the song Keith had written about his experience with Reba, about being on the verge of giving up when someone's kindness changes everything. Radio stations picked it up in July, and by August it was climbing the country charts. Keith watched in amazement as the song connected with audiences across America. People called into radio stations, sharing their own stories of almost giving up before someone believed in them. The song resonated because it was authentic, born from Keith's real experience rather than calculated for commercial success. In September, almost a year after his encounter with Reba, Keith's single reached #1 on the Billboard country charts. He was performing at a festival in Texas when he got the news, and he immediately called Jeremy. "We did it," Jeremy said, his voice full of emotion. "Your first #1 hit, Keith, and it won't be your last." That night, Keith called his mother in Australia to share the news. She cried with joy, telling him how she'd always known he had something special. He called his brothers, who joked about him being too famous to talk to them now. He called Vincent Moretti, who gruffly congratulated him while pretending not to be moved. He called Christina Hayes, who screamed with excitement and made him promise to get her tickets to his next show. And he called REBA MCENTIRE, who'd started all of this with 3 simple words: